Madison Chin, an experienced cardiac nurse at a prestigious Boston hospital, is publicly humiliated by Dr. Richard Holloway, a powerful cardiac surgeon. Hours later, Holloway collapses in the ER with ventricular fibrillation. Madison performs life-saving CPR. Holloway survives and publicly apologizes. Hospital culture briefly shifts toward respect for nurses. Soon, Madison discovers a systemic pharmacy database error that likely caused Holloway's earlier collapse. Exposing it would force the hospital into scandal and might undermine the fragile cultural gains. Torn between protecting new respect for nursing and exposing truth, Madison compiles evidence and reports it to hospital leadership and the state board. The fluorescent light in room 312 hummed like a tiny, indifferent universe. Madison Chin moved through it the way she moved through decades of shifts, with quiet muscle memory. Check the monitor, tap the chart, smooth the blanket. Outside, Boston wore October-like armor. Inside, the air was filtered and chlorinated and full of small urgent breaths. Mr. Patterson mumbled about his wife's lemon cake and the commute he would take when he felt better. Madison smiled, because that's another part of the job, remembering what the sick person used to be. She adjusted the narrated the med change aloud because that's how you keep the whole machine honest, a voice, a record, a human tether. The breeze of authority arrived before Dr. Richard Holloway did. 2 residents' footsteps, a student's nervous intake, the confident clack of a surgeon who did not need to ask for attention. He entered like a titled man stepping into his estate, the room aligning around him. Madison felt the tilt in the air, the way people narrowed to accommodate someone used to being obeyed. Chin, he said, a single syllable like punctuation. He didn't look at her. He asked why Mr. Patterson hadn't received a beta blocker this morning. Madison slid the chart across the bed rail. He received metoprolol at 9, documented, she said, calm as a practiced incantation. Holloway's eyes flicked to the paper as if it were an inconvenience. Don't tell me what's documented, he snapped. Why is his blood pressure still elevated? She was both surprised and not. The question was familiar, the tone an old design. 138/88 is within expected recovery placement for this procedure, Dr. Morrison noted gradual improvement expected over 48 hours. You think you're a cardiologist now, Chin? His voice flattened like ice. The residents shifted, the student swallowed. Mr. Patterson went still, like a man who had accidentally witnessed a duel he'd not bet on. Her hands went steady even when her pulse went hot. This was not about blood pressure. It was a performance, the surgeon reasserting a hierarchy. Madison had watched the routine before, the public correction that whispered to everyone where they stood. You are a nurse, Holloway said, stepping forward into the thin radius of his authority. Your job is to do what I say when I say it. Do you understand? Yes, Madison said, soft with a clarity that was not defeat. She had 7 years of being visible only in crisis, of holding final breaths and quietly resuming the machine of care. She had developed a vocabulary that never made headlines, steady hands, thorough notes, watching. When Holloway left, the room exhaled, but the bruise of his tone lingered. As he swept out with his entourage, the residents' faces showed a mixture of guilt and survival. Dr. Sarah Kim, a resident he'd trained and whom Madison had once mentored through simple bedside technique, glanced at Madison with a brief apology she could not voice. Later, in the nurses' break room, someone joked Holloway's name like a bad weather forecast, inevitable and unpleasant. He did that to me last month, Amy said. Wrote me up for insubordination after I questioned a dosage that would have tanked a patient's kidneys. Laughter that was not really laughter circled their table. Madison sipped burnt coffee and let the anger ebb into routine. Being visible, she had learned, did not mean being heard. Her phone vibrated with messages, all the little anchors of life outside the hospital, but the thread underneath them was thin. Hospital policy, schedules, a world that treated competence as obligation, not grace. At 14:30, the overhead monitor shattered that brittle normal, code blue, emergency room, Bay 3. The voice on the tannoy was a bell through thin ice. The word lodged in her like a hand at the base of the throat. She left her mug, left the conversation, and ran. In the corridor, she felt the sudden electric permission that every nurse knows. Your presence is a tool, and tools aren't asked, they are needed. She had no idea yet who was the patient. She only knew what code blue felt like before seeing anything, an animal surge of motion, the hospital folding into one precise machine. She would soon discover that the machine would demand something that would ask her to reconcile all the small indignities of her day with the raw necessity of saving a life. The ER smelled of antiseptic and adrenaline. Voices overlapped like a chorus trying to outsing a cacophony. Madison pushed through the press of bodies and landed at Bay 3. Dr. Sarah Kim was on the board, compressions fast but shallow, eyes wide where fear had leached into control. Around her, a flurry of technicians, a resident fumbling with lines, someone barking the rhythms of emergency medicine. Holloway lay on the gurney like a man who'd shrunk in his own myth, grayed, breath shallow, hands folded oddly across his chest. His hair clung to his temples. For a suspended second, Madison felt the memory of his words, the razor of humiliation, and the physical reflex that follows, a small, private question of whether this man deserved to be pulled back from the edge. Then the monitor announced its verdict: ventricular fibrillation. The defibrillator's charge hummed like a pending thunderclap. Sarah leaned to deliver a shock. Holloway's body convulsed, and the rhythm snapped back to the same twitching menace. The attending barked orders, charge to 200, then 300, each command a bead on an imperative string. Madison watched the compressions and felt something else. The compression depth was wrong. 2 inches where 4 were needed. Hands that trembled. "I'm a nurse," she told herself, and then the truth arrived like a tide. "You do this." She stepped forward. "Let me," she said, voice low enough for desperation, loud enough for command. In that small exchange, professional lines blurred into the single line that matters at codes: who can make blood move? She locked her shoulders, anchored her elbows, and descended into the mechanics she had practiced until her palms ached. 30 compressions, hard, angled, precise. The gurney rattled beneath her. Ribs cracked once, faint as a branch in the dark. Compromise is sometimes made of breaking things that are meant to break. Around her, people whispered, murmured approval. The monitor, after an assault of shocks and breaths, finally offered a slow, ragged sinus rhythm. The word pulse broke across the room like a benediction. In the quiet that followed, Madison felt not relief so much as the weight of contradiction. She'd given the intervention precisely because she had been trained to. She'd given it despite the morning's indignity, and there was something both trivial and monumental about that choice. Her arms trembled as if the fight had left its signature in muscle. Word rippled through the hospital with the velocity of gossip fed by adrenaline. The nurse who had performed the compressions that saved Dr. Holloway. Stories accrue meaning as they're told. Each retelling nudged the event toward a narrative. Administrators smelled opportunity. The department head, Dr. Morrison, found Madison and said words that felt like sunlight and ice together. "You did more than your job." Holloway's wake of consequence was immediate. He was alive, yes, but fragile, moved to the cardiac ICU and attached to a grid of tubes and monitors that translated his bodily chaos into beeps. And then, quieter and stranger than a public accolade, came his request. He wanted to see Madison. He wanted to speak to the nurse he had demeaned. That request was odd in its intimacy. It carried something the OR never allowed: direct accountability, or at least, the performance of it. As Madison pulled on a mask and entered the ICU, she saw a man diminished yet unfamiliar. He looked at her not like a task to be performed, but like someone trying to meet a debt he'd never known how to pay. "Nurse Chin," he said, and when he used her name it was brittle as glass. His eyes leaked a sudden, unpracticed sorrow. "Why did you help me?" he asked. The question hung there, naked and blunt. She could have answered with calibrated professionalism, protocol, duty, the compact signed by every clinician. Instead, she said, "Because my job is to save people." The sentence held everything and nothing, a moral baseline, a refusal to make the moment about him, even as every person in the room searched his face for transformation. That evening the hospital shifted around a new axis. Dr. Holloway's gratitude sparked admin memos, an offer to nominate Madison for awards, and a wave of media interest that smelled of feel-good headlines. But under the surface, currents moved differently. Residents watched with new curiosity, Nurses traded glances, and someone in purchasing did a numbers check over whether gratitude could be monetized into PR. Madison returned to her floor and resumed the small rituals, charting, checking vitals, calming a patient's breath before a procedure. Her hands moved with the same surety as before, but now each movement was seen by eyes that placed value where none had been measured before. She found the attention awkward, the accolades uneasy. It was easier to close a door and be a nurse again, but she felt the first small, unfamiliar tug of being someone more visible, and with visibility came a new horizon of risk. The hospital celebrated the narrowest of miracles, and Madison learned how quickly praise could harden into expectation. Holloway sat in morning huddles like a man newly chastened, apologetic in public and meticulous in thanking the nurses whose competence he had only noticed when his life depended on it. Morning rounds changed tone. Administration loved the optics. Donors called. A small plaque was proposed. For a few days the work felt lighter, like a hallway lit by a different bulb. But beneath the curated narrative something scraped. Sarah Kim pulled Madison aside midweek, hands trembling as she poured out a story that sounded like a confession. "He's polite now when people are watching," she said, "but last week, when it was just us, he dismissed my question about anticoagulation, told me to save nursing theory for bedside in front of a team." Her voice was raw. "Madison, I think the change is partly a reaction to nearly dying. I think some of it's guilt." Madison nodded, her skepticism braided into gratitude. Holloway's tears in ICU had been a revelation, but revelations can be theatrical. If the doctor's remorse was the product of a preventable system failure rather than fate, then the hospital's corrective measures might be fragile veneer over a leaky hull. That doubt matured into evidence in an unglamorous way, a routine med reconciliation. Madison was cross-checking charts after a long night when something in Mr. Richardson's discharge paperwork nudged the part of her brain trained to sense imbalance. The blood thinner dose listed for a man of his age and renal profile read oddly high. She frowned, then traced the prescription back in the system. Digital breadcrumbs were rarely neat, but when they lined up they made patterns. The pharmacy's database showed incorrect form fields. A version mismatch with an external medication list had failed to flag a lethal interaction. A single table field left unupdated, a default entry that had propagated. Madison's fingers trembled as she pulled cases, timestamps, alerts that hadn't fired, a thin file of 2 prior events buried in ticket logs. One had led to a severe bleed, another had nearly led to an arrest. And in the margins, a report annotated with the phrase, "Issue resolved," without an owner or a patch. She took the discovery to Marcus, and he leaned in the way other clinicians lean into danger, with remote shock and immediate pragmatics. "If this is systemic," he said, "it's not just Holloway's collapse. It's dozens of people." The hospital's tech stack was not malicious, it was negligent, and negligence is a quieter villain until a life is lost. As Madison dug deeper, the pieces told a more difficult story. The database error likely contributed to Holloway's previous arrest. The chain of causation was not theatrical but merciless. Wrong data, missed alert, dangerous interaction, physiologic cascade. The near redemption that had rallied the hospital now had the soft center of something preventable. The choice unfurled before her. Expose the error, and the narrative of transformation collapses into scandal. The collaborative rounds might be dismissed as PR, administrators would batten down, lawyers would arrive, donors would talk about risk. Nurses might be pushed back to margins as the institution prioritized containment. Or she could close her mouth and let the change persist, a shriven Holloway lobbying for better care, but built on the lie that fate, not a broken system, had nearly taken him. Madison felt the rooms of the hospital rearrange into an impossible architecture, ethics on one wing, pragmatic progress on another. She imagined, with the same professional clarity that guided her hands during compressions, the lives yet to be affected if the database stayed as it was. She also imagined the fragile gains, educational programs, nurses in rounds, small shifts in daily respect, unstitched. She slept poorly that night. The moral arithmetic of whistleblowing versus preservation is not numbers, it is reputations, families, livelihoods, and the quiet ones who will keep handing out meds from a database that does not always warn. The next morning, she took printouts, secure screenshots, and timestamps, the forensic language of digital error, and she placed them on Dr. Morrison's desk before anyone could reframe the story again. "You have evidence," Sarah had said as Madison left the coffee shop the night before. "Then you do what you must." Madison thought about the word must. It sounded like a summons. By the time the sealed envelope waited for Madison on Dr. Morrison's desk, the hospital had already rearranged itself around the new problem, not only a technical error, but the political velocity it carried. The envelope contained the same documents Madison had assembled: logs, flagged entries, patient charts with red-line dosages, but now they were not just proof, they were detonators. Dr. Morrison sat with the kind of softness reserved for hard conversations. "You compiled this," she said, and Madison nodded. The director's face carried a map of risks and loyalties: loyalty to the institution, to patients, and to an emergent public story that had become good press. "We appreciate your thoroughness, Madison. This is serious. I'll call Whitmore. We'll escalate to quality assurance." But escalation has lobes. The QA process implies time, bureaucratic containment, an attempt to ensure that when the truth surfaces it does so on the hospital's schedule. Madison imagined their timeline as something that might allow more patients to be harmed. The board would do slow-tooth bureaucracy, lawyers would counsel caution. Within hours, the rumor mill spun faster. The Richardson family's earlier complaint, the $10 million pledge, the hospital's polished PR team, all began to hover near the edges again like birds waiting for a storm. Whitmore's office called to request a meeting. "We need a conversation," the administrator said. It was never simply about facts and parks of power. It was about who bore reputational cost. Meanwhile, the staff's reaction hardened. Some hailed Madison as a principled guardian of safety. Others whispered that she'd risked the new gains. Paula and Christine's conversations soured into clipped accusations. Was Madison trying to elevate herself? Had she used the Holloway incident as leverage? The instantaneousness of public recognition had produced a fissure between nurses who'd always stayed in the shadows and the one who now cast a long, unwanted light. Sarah Kim's pressure evolved into a different kind of fear. She'd confided that supporting Madison might cost her residency, or at least, a smooth path through a supervisor who still held sway. "He's begun mentoring us again," she said. He might retaliate if he thinks the program is threatened." In that fear was a moral test, the residency's preservation versus the patient's safety. Madison felt each of those voices as weight. She'd always reshaped discomfort into care: triage, stabilize, escalate. Now every choice became triage of institutions, histories, lives. Her evenings were stolen by reading reports and redlining possibilities, by preparing for the fallout she knew would come. The hospital called a closed meeting: quality assurance, legal counsel, the pharmacy director, Dr. Morrison, and Whitmore. Madison was asked to present her findings. She felt the gravity of being the person who must translate for others the precise arithmetic of a system's failure: which code fired, which packet failed to update, which patient warnings remained silent. Her voice steadied as she walked the room through the sequence: database lapse, unflagged interaction, 2 prior near Mrs. Holloway's event as probable outcome. At the end of her presentation, there was a silence that might have been awe or calculation. Whitmore's face was carefully blank. The counsel's expression was a lawyer with scales hidden in the pocket. "Thank you, Miss Chen," he said, voice soft. "We'll launch an internal investigation." Launch, for Madison, was a verb with teeth. She had done the thing that professional ethics demanded. But as she left through the hospital corridor, whispers followed her like drafts beneath doors. Some called her brave. Some called her reckless. In the ICU, Holloway's chair remained empty. His recovery had stops and starts and a dependency on the processes she had pushed to reveal. At home that night, Madison sat in the small lamp glow with Pepper, her tabby, curled like a comma at her feet. The phone buzzes still with messages, invitations, congratulations, threats thin as wire. She could not sleep. If the hospital buried the problem, patients would remain at invisible risk. If the hospital spilled it, everything might topple and the fragile progress in nurse recognition might collapse into recrimination. Justice had no simple ledger. Only consequences, hard, broad, uncompromising, waited. The next morning, an email hit her inbox. An external party, the Massachusetts Board of Registration in Pharmacy, had logged the anonymous tip. Someone had already done similar work. The lid she'd sought to lift might just blow the whole structure open. The moment the board called, the hospital became a different creature, smaller, angrier, attentive in the way a shark feels a bruise. Whitmore convened an emergency meeting and insisted on damage control. Counsel drafted memos, PR rehearsed responses with calm, synthetic voices. Dr. Morrison pleaded for transparency while measuring the legal fallout. The pharmacy director's jaw tightened. The IT office scrubbed logs in a way that looked like careful work and also like performance. The board wanted everything. They wanted logs and chain of custody and proof that corrective action began immediately. They wanted accountability. Whitmore's face lost its managerial ease. Now he spoke of liability, donors, the possibility of lawsuits that could eclipse research grants and staffing budgets. For him, the calculus was simple: mitigate, contain, survive. Madison found herself at the axis of competing energies. Nurses whispered support. Doctors avoided eye contact. Some residents pretended nothing had changed. The hospital's PR surge painted Madison as a heroic exemplar, while behind closed doors discussions moved to contingency plans in case families sued. It felt like being pulled between being the symbol and being the scapegoat. Then the Richardson family did something unexpected. Victoria Richardson arrived at the hospital with a reporter in tow, having discovered the links through a friend. She demanded answers not as a donor, but as a daughter who had nearly lost a father to medication mismanagement. The optics shifted. Whitmore paced. The board called for an immediate audit. The hospital's capacity to manage the narrative cratered under the pressure of someone with resources insisting on the truth. Holloway was awake but fragile. He sat in the visitor chair, pale and small. Watching the hospital, he had once commanded speed toward scrutiny. He asked to speak to Madison privately. In Hospice's soft voice he said, "You did the right thing." There was no theater now, only broken humility. He faltered. "I thought my near death would make me a better man. But this," he gestured helplessly at the flurry of people and papers. "If not for you, I would have been robbed of that chance." His eyes searched her face as if looking for absolution. Madison thought of the board's questions, of families who might sue, of the ripple of jobs that could be lost by prosecution. She thought of nurses regaining dignity and of the old culture she had spent a career navigating. The hospital's identity, its prestige and philanthropic bedrock, trembled under the potential consequences of the truth. Pressure swelled from the top down. Whitmore called a closed meeting with Madison and said, quietly, "If you walk back your complaint, we can implement changes quietly. A software patch, retraining, a statement that does not name systemic culpability. No lawsuits. No donors pulled." He framed the offer like a scalpel, surgical, precise. You could be part of shaping the fix. Moral compromise has many faces. In Madison's mind, she saw two possible futures. One where the hospital fixed the error quietly and the collaborative progress continued. Maybe nurses gained respect, but without the cleansing fire of accountability. And one where the board's involvement led to public reckoning, lawsuits, and a chance to force structural transparency. She asked for a day to think. That night a different kind of pressure arrived. Text messages from nurses clamoring for the quiet fix, residents afraid of career backlash, Dr. Morrison saying she supported full disclosure but feared the hospital's collapse. Sarah called and asked Madison not to ruin her residency. Marcus warned about the layoffs that might follow public litigation. Holloway, in a voice that trembled between contrition and self-preservation, said he would do anything, testify, apologize, reveal all he'd seen. Madison sat on the floor of her tiny kitchen with Pepper's weight against her ankle and the sound of the city outside like indifferent applause. She opened her laptop and typed a single line into a blank email field to the Massachusetts board. "I have additional evidence to submit." Then she stopped. She thought of the nurse who'd been written up for saving a patient, of patients whose charts had been altered to hide mistakes, of the families who would finally have names. She hit send. The next morning, the hospital held a press conference. Whitmore spoke of immediate remedial steps. Dr. Morrison announced cooperation with the board. The board confirmed an inquiry. Reporters asked whether the institution would face litigation. Madison stood in the periphery, pressed between cameras and clinicians. She felt as if she had stepped off a cliff and was watching the air rearrange itself, sometimes blunted into support, sometimes cutting into reputation. In the days that followed, lawsuits were threatened, donors called counsel, and a cascade of audits began. Many in the hospital breathed uneasily. Some stopped speaking to Madison. But in the quiet rooms where patients slept, medication lists were being cross-checked with a new fervor, pharmacy flags updated, warning windows no longer silent. The hospital's machine shuddered, but some parts of it began to mend. Months later, the hospital smelled different, still antiseptic, but with edges of vigilance. The board's audit had forced an overhaul of the pharmacy database, technicians rewired protocols, and an internal reporting system got teeth. The legal dust clouded and settled into settlements and policy memos. Money moved, apologies were drafted and read aloud, and Whitmore learned the legal calculus of reputational survival. Madison returned to her floor with the wary clarity of someone who had stirred the water and watched both fish and debris surface. Some coworkers avoided her, not from malice, but from fear of being caught on the wrong side of institutional tides. Others, younger nurses, newly emboldened, sought her out with quiet gratitude or to ask for the kind of advice she gave freely now: how to document, how to speak up without losing a job. She taught a class on medication reconciliation. The attendants included residents, techs, and a small group of administrators whose faces had shifted from annoyance to attention. Holloway's public posture remained a study in awkward humility. He continued to advocate for collaborative rounds and supported funding for the nursing mentorship program he'd promised. He presented at a seminar about the dangers of arrogance in medicine. His voice sometimes cracked as he recounted his own near-miss. Whether the change in him was fully, permanently internalized, no one could say. People are not uniformly redeemable, but they are unpredictably educable. Madison's decision cost her in ways she had not fully predicted. The hospital's PR machine, which once sought to crown her as hero, sometimes reduced her narrative into digestible soundbites that did not include the 17th moment, the quiet administrative meeting where she had been urged to temper the facts. People loved the idea of a single dramatic rescue, less so the slow grind of systemic reform. Yet in small victories she found her currency: a pharmacist who now called nurses at shift change to confirm complex regimens, a resident who stood up in rounds and deferred to a nurse's insight, a patient whose chart was corrected before a dangerous interaction could occur. Johns Hopkins did follow up about a leadership role, as had been floated earlier in the story, but Madison declined the rapid lift. She realized the change worth doing might not require leaving, but staying and knitting new muscle into the old framework. She accepted instead an opportunity to lead a collaborative task force, cross-disciplinary, with real authority to rewrite protocols, a job that allowed her to remain in the bloodstream of the hospital she loved, imperfect as it was. Some nights she still woke to the rhythm of compressions. Sometimes the memory arrived as a sting: the look on Holloway's face, the rib cracking under her hands, the overwhelming, amphibian sensation of holding a life in one's palms. But then Pepper would leap onto the bed, an irreverent punctuation of normal life, and Madison would breathe out. The hospital's culture did not flip like a switch. Old hierarchies persisted in corners. Yet there were more conversations at the bedside, more nurses included in diagnostic huddles, and fewer public humiliations staged as pedagogy. The structural changes were messy, colored by lawsuits and settlements, by the hard grind of policy implementation and the soft, stubborn work of human behavior change. At a small ceremony that winter, the nursing award that had once been nearly tokenized was given a new rubric: transparency, patient safety, and advocacy. Madison stood in the back, coat folded across her arm, and watched as Dr. Morrison read the names of nurses who had, in handful and in chorus, done what their profession asks, insisted on safety, documented carefully, and refused to let the machine fail quietly. Afterward, Holloway approached her. He looked older in the lines that care and worry carve. "You did exactly what you should have done," he said, not as a plea but as fact. Madison nodded. Forgiveness stayed unlit between them, not because she required a public absolution, but because it is a slow currency. "Thank you for not letting the institution hide itself," she said. He swallowed. "I don't expect forgiveness," he answered. "But I do expect to keep learning." Madison stepped outside into the crisp Boston air. The leaves were fewer now, the streetlights small halos on wet pavement. She felt the particular mixture of exhaustion and clarity that comes after having chosen what you thought was right and watching it ripple outward. She had not been vindicated by headline glory. She had been complicated by consequence. She had, however, forced the hospital to treat transparency as currency and safety as obligation. She walked home slowly, thinking of the patients whose lists were flagged anew, of the residents who now paused before assuming authority, of the nurses who slept easier knowing the system had a new pulse. Pepper met her at the door, a small living present. Madison sat, and in the quiet, she felt the steady beat of a life that had chosen to keep beating, because someone, finally, had refused to let it be silenced for convenience.